The wind was the first thing that had been kind to her in a week. It was a mean sort of kindness, the kind that scoured the skin with dust and made the eyes water, but it was honest. It made no promises it could not keep. It whipped the loose strands of her black hair across her face, a temporary veil against the eyes of the men in the dirt street of Red Creek. Her feet were bare on the hard-packed earth, the soles of them cracked and bleeding. The rough hemp of the rope bit into her wrists where they were tied to a hitching post, the same post where men tied their horses and mules. She had been there since sunup, a fixture of public shame. She was a thing to be disposed of, a refusal given form. Her crime was a single word, no. Spoken to a warrior named Kalen, a man whose pride was as vast and as barren as the flats beyond the town. He had not taken the refusal well. He had dragged her here, to this place where tribal law frayed into the cruder laws of settlers and traders, and declared her forfeit. She was property that had malfunctioned. The townsfolk stared. Some sneered, their faces pinched with a casual cruelty. Others just glanced, a flicker of pity perhaps, before turning back to their business. Pity was a useless currency here. It bought nothing. She kept her eyes fixed on a loose board on the front of the general store, counting the grains in the wood. It was a way to make the world small enough to bear. A child, no older than 5, pointed a sticky finger. His mother pulled his hand down, her whisper sharp and quick, a sound like a striking snake. The girl did not flinch. She had built a wall inside herself, stone by silent stone, and she lived behind it now. The sun climbed, a merciless white eye in the bleached sky. Thirst was a living thing in her throat, a creature with claws. The dust lifted from the street with every passing wagon, a fine red powder that settled on her skin, in her hair, on her cracked lips, tasted of indifference. Then she saw him. He was not part of the gawking crowd. He leaned against the shaded wall of the smithy, half hidden in the gloom of the overhang. An old man, or old enough. His face was a roadmap of seasons, canyons carved by sun and sorrow. He wore a worn duster the color of the earth and his hat was pulled low, but she could see the gray in his beard, the weary set of his shoulders. He was not looking at her like she was a spectacle. He was just watching, as if he were watching a storm gather on the horizon. He carried whole winters in his eyes. Kalen finally emerged from the saloon, smelling of sour whiskey and self-importance. He swaggered to the post, his steps heavy with ownership. He gestured to her, a sweeping motion of his arm as if presenting a prize sow at a fair. "She is strong," he announced to the street, though few were listening anymore. "Good for work. Broke her spirit myself." A lie. He had broken her body, but her spirit had simply gone elsewhere, to a place he could not reach. "Who will take this burden?" Kalen boomed, his voice thick with false magnanimity. "Settle a debt? A few dollars for your trouble?" The silence that answered was heavy and complete. The wind died down, as if the land itself was holding its breath. The old man pushed himself off the wall. He moved without haste, his boots scuffing softly in the dust. He did not look at Kalen. His eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, were on her. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze direct, unwavering. It was the first time all day anyone had looked at her like she was a person. "I'll take her," he said. His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together at the bottom of a creek bed. It was not a voice of passion or charity. It was a voice of decision. Kalen's eyes narrowed. He looked the old man up and down, a dismissive curl to his lip. "You, Eliam? What would an old, broken-down rancher want with her? You can't even work your own land since your woman passed." The old man, Eliam, did not rise to the bait. His expression did not change. "That debt you owe me for the seed grain last spring. The one you conveniently forgot. We'll call it paid." Kalen bristled. The debt was a sore point, a matter of public knowledge he preferred to ignore. To be called on it now, in front of the town, was an insult. He glanced at her, then back at Eliam. He saw a chance to rid himself of a problem and settle a score in one stroke. "Fine," Kalen spat, as if doing Ilium a great favor. She's your problem now. Don't come crying to me when she runs. Ilium gave a slow, deliberate nod. He walked past Kalen, his focus entirely on the girl. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, worn pocket knife. The blade clicked open, a small, sharp sound in the quiet street. He knelt. She flinched, a tremor that ran through her whole body. Her eyes, wide and dark, finally met his. They were filled with a fear so deep it had no bottom. He did not touch her. He simply reached for the ropes at her wrists, his movements slow, predictable. He sawed at the thick hemp, his knuckles brushing against the wood of the post. The fibers gave way with a sigh. Her hands fell to her lap, limp and useless. The rope burns were raw and red against her skin. He folded the knife and slipped it back into his pocket. He stood, his joints creaking in protest. "Get up," he said, his voice still that same low rumble. It was not a command, but a statement of what came next. She looked from his face to her freed hands, then back again. Slowly, painfully, she pushed herself to her feet. Her legs trembled, weak from disuse. She swayed, and for a moment, it seemed she would fall. He made no move to steady her. He simply waited, giving her the space to find her own balance. He turned and started walking, not looking back to see if she followed. He led his horse, a sway-backed mare with a patient eye, by the reins. For a long moment, she remained by the post, a ghost haunting the scene of her own humiliation. The townsfolk were watching again, their curiosity renewed. She could feel their stares like tiny pinpricks on her skin. Then she looked at the back of the old man, a straight, unyielding line moving away from the town, toward the open, empty land. She took a step, then another. Her bare feet patted softly in the dust. He stirred up, a silent shadow trailing a silent man. The journey began not with a word, but with a choice to follow. They walked for what felt like hours. The sun beat down, and the world was shades of brown and ochre. The silence between them was vast, a landscape of its own. It was not an angry silence, nor a comfortable one. It was a waiting silence, open, empty. He did not set a fast pace. He seemed to move with the rhythm of the land itself, slow and deliberate. Several times, he stopped and unhooked a canteen from his saddle. He drank, then held it out to her without a word. The first time, she hesitated, her ingrained caution warring with the fire in her throat. His arm remained steady, an offering without expectation. She finally took it, her fingers brushing his calloused hand. The water was warm and tasted of metal, but it was the kindest thing she had ever known. They left the last traces of Red Creek behind, winding their way into the low, rolling hills. The land grew harsher, stonier. The wind was a constant companion, whispering through the sparse, tough grasses. As dusk began to bleed blood orange and violet across the sky, they arrived. The place was not a ranch so much as a scar on the land that was trying to heal. A small, weathered cabin stood against the backdrop of a stark mesa. A corral with a single fence rail broken held no animals. A barn leaned slightly, as if tired of standing against the wind. It was a place defined by what it lacked. And on a small rise overlooking the cabin, there was a single grave, marked by a simple wooden cross. Ilium led the horse to a trough, then turned to her. He gestured toward the cabin with his chin. Food. The inside of the house was spare and clean. A stone hearth dominated one wall. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in the center of the room. A single cot was in one corner, a patchwork quilt folded neatly upon it. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, dust, and something else. A lingering absence, the ghost of a life that was no longer lived there. He moved with a familiar economy, lighting a lamp that cast flickering, golden shadows on the walls. He stoked the embers in the hearth, adding a few pieces of dry juniper. The fire caught, crackling to life, and the room seemed to breathe again. He ladled stew from a pot that hung on a hook over the coals into 2 wooden bowls. It was thin, mostly broth and a few vegetables, but the smell made her stomach clench with a painful hunger. He placed one bowl on the table in front of a chair, then sat in the other, his own bowl before him. He did not watch her. He just began to eat, his spoon scraping softly against the wood. She stood by the door, a stranger in a strange house, the warmth of the fire a foreign sensation on her skin. He did not press her. He simply left the invitation open. After a moment that stretched into an eternity, she moved to the table. She sat, her movements stiff and cautious. She picked up the spoon. The first taste was an explosion of warmth and flavor. It was just stew, but it was also safety. It was shelter. It was the end of the day at the hitching post. She ate quickly, her eyes on her bowl, and did not stop until it was empty. When she was done, he pointed to a small, adjoining room. "That's your room. The door doesn't lock. I don't lock doors." The statement hung in the air, a promise more solid than any bolt or bar. She went into the room. It was tiny, containing only a narrow cot with a thin mattress and a clean, folded blanket. A small window looked out onto the vast, star-dusted darkness. She lay down on the cot, pulling the rough wool blanket up to her chin. For the first time in more days than she could count, she was not bound. She was not on display. She was warm. She did not sleep. She listened to the sounds of the house. The groan of the wood, the whisper of the wind around the eaves, the soft crackle of the dying fire. She listened to the steady, quiet breathing of the old man in the next room. And in the space between those sounds, she began to feel the first, faint thawing of the ice around her heart. The days settled into a rhythm, as quiet and steady as a slow pulse. There were no orders given, no expectations voiced. There was only the work. He would rise before the sun, his movements quiet, respectful of her sleep. He would mend the fences, his hammer blows a distant, rhythmic counterpoint to the morning birds. He chopped wood, the sharp crack of the axe splitting the silence. She began to claim a space for herself in the quiet corners of the cabin. She started by sweeping the floor, the swish of the broom a soft, percussive sound. He noticed but said nothing. He just tracked in a little less dust the next day. She found his mending basket, a jumble of raw thread and worn needles. His shirt had a tear near the cuff. While he was outside, she sat by the fire, her small, nimble fingers stitching the frayed cloth together. The stitches were neat and even, a line of order imposed on a small piece of chaos. When he came in for his supper, he saw the mended shirt folded on his cot. His gaze lingered on it for a moment before he looked at her. A silent question, a silent answer. He simply nodded, a barely perceptible dip of his chin. Their lives ran in parallel, two rivers flowing through the same dry land. They worked, they ate, they sat by the fire in the evenings, the silence between them no longer empty, but filled with the unspoken language of shared space. One afternoon, while wandering the property, she found a patch of stubborn wildflowers clinging to life in the shelter of a large rock. They were a dusty purple, small but resilient. She picked one. On her way back to the cabin, she passed the grave on the hill. The wooden cross was weathered, the name carved into it, Sarah, fading but still legible. On impulse, she knelt and laid the small, purple flower at the base of the cross. It was a tiny splash of color against the muted earth tones of the landscape. Later that evening, as he prepared their meal, he spoke. That was a kind thing to do. His voice startled her. They had gone for days without speaking more than a single word at a time. She looked up from the bowl she was wiping dry. He was not looking at her, but at the fire. She liked the wildflowers, he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. Even the stubborn ones. He said nothing more, but the air in the cabin had changed. He had shared a piece of his sorrow with her, a small, polished stone from the great weight of his grief. The next evening, the air turned cold with the unexpected bite of an early autumn. She sat huddled by the fire, her thin dress offering little protection. Eliam rose from his chair, went to a large wooden chest in the corner, and took out a heavy wool shawl. It was dark gray, soft and worn with use. He draped it over her shoulders without a word. The warmth of it sank into her bones. It smelled of him, of wood smoke and cedar and something uniquely his. She pulled it tighter around herself, a shield against the cold, and a comfort she had not realized she so desperately needed. A few nights later, the past came for her in her sleep. She was back at the post, the ropes biting into her wrists, the sun a hot poker against her skin. Kalen's face loomed over her, his voice a torrent of insults. The crowd was laughing, their faces twisted into cruel masks. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. She was choking on dust and fear. She woke with a gasp, sitting bolt upright on the cot, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The room was dark, the only light a sliver of moon through the small window. A floorboard creaked in the other room. "You're safe." His voice came through the darkness, low and steady. He was not at her door, but a respectful distance away. "It was just a dream. You're safe here." She wrapped her arms around her knees, trembling. His voice was an anchor in the swirling chaos of her mind. She listened to the sound of his quiet breathing until her own heartbeat slowed, until the ghosts of Red Creek receded back into the shadows. The next morning, as they sat at the table with their oatmeal, she found her voice. "Why?" The word was small, fragile in the morning quiet. He looked up from his bowl, his pale eyes meeting hers. He knew what she was asking. Why her? Why bother? He considered the question for a long time, stirring his oatmeal as if the answer might be found there. "I saw my wife in you," he said finally, his voice rough with memory. "Not in your face or your hair, but in your stillness." Sarah was still like that when the sickness took her. She fought, but she did it on the inside. Quietly. I couldn't do anything for her. Not really. Just watch her fade. He looked out the window toward the grave on the hill. "When I saw you at that post," he continued, his gaze returning to her, "tied up for being stubborn, for having a will of your own, I just figured I wasn't going to stand by and do nothing again. No one should be tied to a post for saying no." He had stitched his past to her present, not out of pity, but out of a shared, unspoken understanding of quiet defiance. She looked down at her hands, resting on the rough wood of the table. For the first time, she felt not like a rescued object, but like a person who had been seen, truly seen. The bread she baked that week was a little less dense. When he tried a piece warm from the hearth, he grunted. Better. She almost smiled. The sanctuary they had built of silence and routine was fragile, a thing of glass in a world of stone. They both knew it. The piece had a deadline. Came on a Tuesday. The harbinger was a cloud of dust on the eastern horizon, too large and moving too fast to be a lone rider or a stray herd. Ilium saw it first. He was splitting wood by the barn, and he stopped, axe in hand, his body going unnaturally still. He watched the cloud for a long moment, his face hardening into a mask of grim resolve. She was by the well, drawing water, when she saw him watching the horizon. She followed his gaze and her stomach went cold. She knew that signature of dust. It was the arrogance of men who believe the land belongs to them, who ride without regard for what they trample. It was Kalen. Without a word, Ilium walked to the cabin. She followed, leaving the bucket by the well. He took his rifle from its pegs above the hearth, checked the load with an economy of motion that spoke of long familiarity, and then went to stand on the porch. He did not tell her to hide. He did not tell her to run. He simply stood there, a silent, unmovable object waiting for an unstoppable force. She stood in the doorway behind him, the heavy wool shawl clutched in her hands. The wind whipped her hair across her face, but this time it did not feel kind. Felt like a warning. The riders resolved out of the dust, 5 of them with Kalen at their head. They reined in their horses a few yards from the cabin, the animals nervous and stamping, sensing the tension in the air. Kalen's eyes swept over the property with a contemptuous sneer. He looked at Ilium, then his gaze slid past him to the girl in the doorway. A cruel, possessive smile touched his lips. "I've come for what is mine, old man," Kalen called out, his voice loud and confident. "My patience has run out. The tribal elders agree she has brought shame and must be dealt with according to our custom." Ilium's grip on the rifle did not tighten. His voice, when he spoke, was dangerously calm. "She is not yours. She is not a thing to be owned. She is on my land, under my protection." "Your protection?" Kalen laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "This patch of dirt? You are one man. I have 4 with me. This is not a negotiation. It is a reclamation. Our law is our law. Your law ended at the edge of town where you tried to sell her for the price of a bar debt," Ilium countered, his voice like flint. "You made your choice. Now live with it." "I have changed my mind," Kalen said, his smile vanishing, his face darkening with rage. He was used to getting his way, through force or intimidation. This quiet defiance was infuriating to him. "Give her to me or we will take her. And we will burn this shack to the ground as a lesson." The men with him shifted, their hands moving closer to the weapons at their belts. It was then that she moved. She stepped out from the doorway, out from behind the shield of Ilium's body, and stood beside him on the porch. She was no longer the broken thing from the hitching post. Her spine was straight, her chin was lifted, her eyes, dark and clear, were fixed on Kalen. The shawl fell from her shoulders, pooling at her feet. She was thin, dressed in a simple frock she had sewn herself from old flour sacks, but she stood as if she were wearing armor. Kalen's eyes widened in surprise. He had expected her to be cowering in a corner. Then she spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the wind and the tension with the clarity of a bell. "I will not go." 3 words. The first had been her crime. These 3 were her declaration of war. Kalen stared at her, momentarily speechless. He had broken her, he thought. He had paraded her shame. How did she dare to speak? His fury, robbed of its target's fear, curdled into something uglier. "You have no choice," he snarled, recovering. "You are a woman. You will do as you are told." He started to dismount, his intent clear. Ilium raised the rifle, not aiming it, but holding it across his chest. "A barrier. You will not set foot on this porch." "Or what, old man? You will shoot us all." Kalen scoffed. At that moment, a new sound entered the standoff. The steady clop 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 of more horses, coming not from the east, but from the direction of Red Creek. A wagon appeared over the rise, followed by 2 riders. It was Mr. Henderson, the store owner, and his 2 strapping sons. They had seen the riders pass and, moved by a flicker of conscience or just plain frontier curiosity, had decided to follow. They pulled up a short distance away, their presence shifting the balance of the equation. This was no longer a private matter on an isolated ranch. It was a public spectacle. Kalen's men looked at each other, their bravado wavering. A confrontation was one thing. A potential gunfight with witnesses was another. Kalen saw it too. His face was a mask of pure, impotent rage. He was a bully, and a bully's power dissolves under impartial eyes. He looked from Ilium's unwavering stance, to the girl's defiant face, to the silent audience that had just arrived. He was beaten, not by force, but by a quiet, unyielding front he could not break. He spat on the ground, a final, futile gesture of contempt. "You will regret this," he hissed, the threat hollow. He wrenched his horse's head around and kicked its flanks, galloping away in a cloud of his own dust. His men, looking relieved, scrambled to follow. The dust settled. The Hendersons gave a curt, respectful nod to Ilium and turned their wagon around, heading back to town. The story would be all over Red Creek by nightfall. And then they were alone again. The silence that descended was profound. The wind whispered through the grass, the only sound in the world. Ilium lowered the rifle. His shoulders sagged slightly, the tension of the last hour draining out of him. He turned to her. His eyes were full of something she could not name. Pride maybe, relief certainly, a deep, quiet awe. "You did not run," he said, his voice thick. "You did not let them take me," she answered, her own voice trembling slightly now that the danger had passed. He reached out, his calloused, gentle hand coming to rest on her shoulder. It was not a gesture of ownership, but of partnership, a sharing of the victory. She did not flinch from his touch. She leaned into it, just for a second, drawing strength from his steadiness. They stood there for a long moment, on the porch of the small, weathered cabin, two solitary figures against a vast landscape. The battle was over. The ground they stood on was finally, truly, theirs. That night, the fire in the hearth seemed to burn brighter. The stew tasted richer. The silence in the cabin was no longer a space between two strangers, but a shared peace between two people who had faced down the ghosts of the past, together. As they were cleaning the bowls, he stopped, a thoughtful look on his face. "I have called you girl in my head this whole time," he said, his voice quiet. "It is not right. You have a name." It was a question, not a demand. He was giving her the choice to share it, to claim her own identity in this new life they had forged. She looked at him, at this man who had bought her freedom with a forgotten debt, who had given her shelter without expectation, who had stood with her against the world. "Anina," she said. The name felt new in her own mouth, a word she had not spoken in so long she had almost forgotten its shape. "Anina," he repeated, testing the sound of it, to fit. It settled in the quiet air of the cabin like it had always belonged there. "My name is Eliam." "I know," she whispered. A new contract had been written, not with ink or law, but with courage and a shared name. Later, as the fire burned down to glowing embers, Eliam took the frayed pieces of rope he had cut from her wrists, which he had kept tucked away on a shelf. He had not known why he kept them. Now he did. He walked to the hearth and dropped them into the coals. They smoked, curled, and then caught flame, turning from a symbol of her bondage into ash and light. The old life was gone, consumed by the fire. The seasons turned. Autumn gave way to a harsh winter, and winter, eventually, yielded to a tentative spring. The broken fence rail on the corral was mended. A few chickens scratched in the yard. The house no longer felt empty. It breathed with the rhythm of their shared lives. One cool spring evening, they sat together on the porch, watching the stars prick the deep indigo sky. The silence was easy now, a comfortable blanket they shared. Anina had repaired his late wife's rocking chair, and she moved back and forth in a gentle, soothing rhythm. She was humming a tune, a soft, melodic sound from a life before Red Creek. Eliam listened, his head leaned back against the post. He felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost painful. The hollow space inside him, the one Sarah's passing had carved out, was not gone. But it was no longer an aching void. It was filled with the quiet strength of the woman beside him, with the smell of baking bread, with the sight of a wildflower on a grave. The house was a home. The land was not a burden, but a future. He had not sought to rescue anyone. He had just tried to do one right thing in a world full of wrong. And in doing so, he had rescued himself. Anina, the girl who had refused, had taught him how to say yes again. Yes to work. Yes to warmth. Yes to life. The final image was not one of passion, but of deep, abiding peace. A man and a woman on a porch, two scars healing together under a sky full of stars, having built a new world out of the ashes of the old. This story, it is not just about a rescue. It is about a naming, about seeing a person where the world sees only an object, a problem, a thing to be used or discarded. It is about the quiet courage it takes to say no to the life you are being forced into, and the even quieter courage it takes to say yes to a future you never imagined. We all have our hitching posts, the places where we are tied by fear, by shame, by the expectations of others. We are told who we are, what we are worth. But the truth is, our value is not determined by the crowd. It is forged in the silence, in the small acts of kindness we give and receive. It is claimed when we finally speak our own name aloud. So here is your naming. Look for the person who sees you when you are invisible. Be the person who offers a canteen of water in the desert. The world will tell you that such small gestures are meaningless in the face of its vast cruelty. Do not believe it. A single mended shirt can stitch a life back together. A single flower on a grave can bridge the gap between two solitudes. And if you are brave enough, if you are quiet enough to listen past the noise, you might just find that the person you set out to save is yourself. You might just find a home on a patch of land you thought was barren, and a future in a silence you thought was empty.